Namaste, everyone. Welcome back to the Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives podcast. Very excited today to introduce you to the political economy vertical. And today we have Yajaji Hariya on the platform. Yajaji has been on Vichaar Manthan a number of times, most recently on the podcast with an episode called Funding Change, which I implore you all to tune back on and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all streaming platforms. But today, most notably, we are going to be talking about the Sustainable Narratives Conference, and in particular, the fireside conversation that Yajaji will be hosting on carbon tax. Yajaji, welcome back to the podcast.
Namaste, and thank you very much. Yeah, very excited.
I think something like carbon and decarbonization and the way that we tax that are ever prevalent today. I think we spoke about it at some detail on the podcast we recorded not too long ago. But tell me a little bit why sustainable narratives is something that Vichaar Manthan is doing, and why something like that might be important in today's world and today's society.
Yeah, so I'm really glad that Vichaar Manthan has taken up sustainable narratives as a conference topic. It did it last year, it's doing it again this year, which is absolutely phenomenal. And really glad that we're starting to really delve into the details of things like the environment, things like climate change, carbon tax, because let's be honest, they are some of the most urgent issues that we're all facing, right? And it's a global issue.
I'm seeing it more and more often, sort of the terms like sustainability and our ESG strategies and policies in place. I was working with a client most recently, and they were heavily interested in something like that to deal with their workloads and their computing needs. But something like carbon and the decarbonization rhetoric is now spanning all industries, all verticals of business. So it's ever prevalent, right? Why do you think it's a challenge for us? Why does something like political economy come into play?
Yeah, well, wow, it's a huge topic, isn't it? And unfortunately, I think actually it's been getting a lot of negative press as well recently. There's been a lot of negative press around greenwashing. A lot of people and a lot of players have been using the terminology, as you say. There's a lot more of it flying around. Climate change, being green, greening the economy, ESG, all of those terms flying around. And I think a lot of the time we're at risk of overpromising and under delivering. And actually, that's why this topic on carbon tax is such an important one, because actually it's a real way of us trying to measure and hold people to account. People, economies, governments, countries, nations, entire regions and the world at large to account to the promises that have been made.
Sure. And so inside the Sustainable Narratives Conference, there is this fireside conversation that you're hosting called Carbon Tax Crafting the Silver Bullet. But let's just take a few steps back, right? For some of our listeners and the audience out there that maybe haven't quite understood what carbon tax is. Could we start there? What is carbon tax?
Yeah. So maybe we take a few steps back, right? So what's the issue? What are we trying to solve here? The problem is that our world is warming, right? That's the big problem, and we need to find a way to limit that. And the promises that have been made so far, and what science tells us is that if we go beyond 1.5 degrees, things are going to get worse. And if we go beyond 2 degrees, it's going to get a lot worse. And then beyond that, everything's really a guessing game. But we know that things certainly aren't going to be good.
Sure. And this has been referenced at things like COP26 and the UN Sustainable Goals and
exactly. And COP27 is another milestone this year, right? Because at COP26, we effectively implored, or governments effectively applied what's called a ratcheting system, which means that they come back at every COP to kind of build on those promises, to kind of find a better version of the promises that they've made, and really try and be as ambitious as they can be. But in essence, what we're trying to do is limit warming. And one of the big things that we can do to try and limit warming is to reduce the amount of carbon emissions that we emit as a world.
Sure.
So currently that stands at about 50 gigatons, right? That's the number to bear in mind. That's where we are today.
Do we know what an average human outputs in a year? Are we able to measure that?
We can measure that. It will vary hugely depending on where you are, what part of the world you're in. So for example, people in India will emit far less individually than people in the UK, and especially in US and China. However, as a nation, India is now the third largest emitter in the world, right?
Sure. Okay.
So lots to think about there.
So this variance, I guess, is sort of individual, nation, maybe industries as well, and then the variance within each person and each thing, and that's probably what's so difficult about creating a taxing system around it.
Exactly. And you see, where we want to get to, where we need to get to, is to this term that we've referred to before, net zero by 2050, right? So net zero means that for the carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere and the carbon that we're taking out, we need to be zero. That the offset needs to be zero, right?
Okay, and we're clearly not there yet.
We're not there yet, absolutely not. We're definitely not there. We're emitting far more emissions than we ever have done.
Are we on the path to that? Is that
we aren't? We definitely aren't. I'd struggle to say that we are on the path. We emitted more in 2021 than we ever have done. We had a slight respite in 2020 from a carbon emissions perspective, right? Because people weren't going out. There were lockdowns all around the world. And 2021 we rebounded, and we rebounded far more than a trajectory would have suggested before, right? So we not only offset the gains that we made in 2020, but we went way beyond that.
And do we know 2022?
It's looking bleak, I have to say. Right? I mean, in the news you may have seen that. So the Ukraine-Russia war is certainly aggravating the situation. But one of the things that Russia is doing at the moment is it's burning something like 8 million pounds worth of gas at the Finnish border, simply because there's no way to deal with that gas. It's not pumping it through to Europe, and so what it's doing is what's called flaring. They're effectively burning that gas.
Clearly, the world is in dire straits. There are issues that we're trying to decarbonize. We're trying to create a carbon tax that helps incentives. We're not on the trajectory. We need an accelerated pace towards net zero. Things like wars, pandemics, and just nation state are, I don't know, it kind of sounds like halting the progress that we're trying to make. So clearly, this is an important idea. And an idea that we should be investing in financially, mentally, and just trying to understand what it means. And perhaps that's why it's so important and has become a fireside conversation at Sustainable Narratives.
Absolutely. And so, carbon tax is well, the question is carbon tax that silver bullet, right? So carbon tax is effectively pricing carbon. And what we're saying is that at the moment, companies are the ones that are emitting the vast majority of carbon emissions, but nobody is holding them to account in any kind of way, right? Okay. So carbon tax or carbon pricing more generally is a way of internalizing that cost. So at the moment, companies are emitting, and what you're seeing is it's society at large that is generally paying for those carbon emissions and the effects of more carbon emissions in the atmosphere and global warming. So what carbon pricing is trying to do is trying to internalize those costs and move and shift those costs back to the people people and the companies and nations that emit those carbon emissions.
I think money is a great motivator, and so if this silver bullet can be crafted, is it all financially motivated? Are there other factors at play?
Well, what's really interesting is that there's been a lot of research around carbon tax and its effectiveness, right? So the ECB, so the European Central Bank, just recently released some research And what they said was actually carbon tax is potentially one of the most effective solutions that they envisage. So the other potential solution is something called green QE, so quantitative easing. So that the idea there is effectively pumping more money into government. So through debt, for example, right? So when you buy government bonds, you're effectively pumping money into governments, right? And there's something now called green bonds. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but there's something called green bonds, right? Which is effectively going to help rebuild green infrastructure. Now, the ECB effectively said that actually that is far less effective, far less effective than implementing an effective carbon tax, right? So there's been lots of research that's gone into this that suggests that carbon taxes are potentially the way forward. But as you already know, and maybe as what we'll discuss, there's plenty of upside and plenty of downside.
Interesting. So I think maybe for those that haven't tuned in or haven't signed up to the Sustainable Narratives conference yet, it is an exclusive event. You will not catch it on YouTube. You do need to register. It's on AirMeet. So go to vichaarmanthan.org. Please do register. It's starting on the 15th of September. You can catch more information about it on our podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all streaming platforms, and indeed on the website. Yojiri, tell me, what are the top 3 challenges as a society we will face when it comes to crafting the silver bullet for carbon tax?
Yeah. So at the moment, right, and maybe a bit of background again, there are 46 countries or 36 countries that have implemented carbon tax, 46 that have implemented some sort of carbon pricing. So we've got lots to learn from, right? So this isn't something that we've just made up today. We've been implementing this for some time. And there are some real challenges. So the first is that at the moment it's really difficult actually to measure carbon emissions, right? So if you're going to apply a tax to something, you have to have a good way of accounting for it, right? When you tax a company on its profits and its revenues, there's a really clear way of accounting for that financial gain, right? There isn't that clarity when you do carbon accounting, and so there's a lot of estimates that go into this. That's problem number one.
Sure.
The second is there's something called carbon arbitrage, right? So what's happening at the moment is that different countries are implementing different carbon taxes, right? There isn't a uniform global carbon tax.
Sure.
And what that means is that if it's cheaper to emit carbon emissions elsewhere, well, companies will just move their functions and their factories to other countries, right?
So I can see why it would become highly politicized.
Yeah.
Buy in one place, sell in another, and cream off the profits, all in the good name of being carbon free or decarbonizing.
And then on top of that, and probably the most relevant issue today, and one that we're all facing already, is this idea of cost of living, right? We're all facing this cost of living crisis. The reality is that implementing carbon taxes without thinking it through could mean that those at the bottom of the pyramid are affected the worst, right? So people who aren't able to pay more for their energy or pay more for their fuel will be the ones that will ultimately be that will be at most detriment.
Yeah,
right?
and then when we're trying to create a wholesome society, a society for all, that's probably not beneficial if you widen the gap between rich and poor. And you can see, like, the gas prices and everything at the moment is a prevalent issue, at least here in the West. Usually, you work in this space. You look at ESG, right? What are some of the learnings? What have we learned so far? What can help us invest in this idea?
So there are a couple of nations that have implemented this and actually done pretty well. So one is Canada's British Columbia. They've implemented it pretty well, and they've had it going for a few years now. And the second is South Africa. So again, they've done pretty well in implementing, and there's been a few learnings from those two. So one is don't try and target every section of the economy at once, right? There's a lot of admin that's required there. In reality, and what we've learned actually when we look at portfolios, so I work for a company that does investment consulting, and what we've realized is that if you want to reduce carbon emissions, actually it's a very small proportion of any investment portfolio that that creates the majority of the carbon emissions in any portfolio, right? So it's usually less than 5% of a portfolio that's creating 80 or 90% of the emissions, right? The same is true of major economies. So what you can do is you can have a much more targeted system, and it's important to implement that. The second is that it's important to deliver these carbon tax increases predictably, right? So people know what's coming, right? Sure. They're not caught off guard. They can prepare for it. Companies can prepare for it. And alongside that preparation, it's important to have that education aspect as well, right? Mm-hmm. So people understand why we're applying these taxes, where the money is going, right? And then the third thing I would say is that using the revenue that governments generate from carbon tax, they should use that to prop up the economy and to help those at the bottom of the pyramid to cope with this carbon tax increase, right? So that because it's important to remember that carbon tax isn't just an environmental issue; it's a social issue as well. Yeah. Right. And that's really important for governments to realize. And that balance is going to be so important.
And it's that cultural shift, right? Sort of, we refer to sort of people, process, and technology. It's going to take an effort of the whole of society to change the issues that we have. Climate change, all these types of things are very real. Something like carbon tax can definitely offset that. But I think, as we discussed in the Funding Change podcast, it's going to require an accelerated effort. The things we're doing today are not enough for tomorrow, and we've got to dig deeper. Great. Thank you very much, Yojiji, for helping us understand a little bit about what this fireside conversation will take place at the Sustainable Narratives Conference. As I mentioned before to everyone listening in, you've got to register online. You've got to get onto AirMeet to understand this and look at all the other panel discussions that are taking place within political economy, thinking about how we democratize capital, thinking about benevolent imperialism, carbon tax as well here with Yojiji, and all the other verticals, things like religion, wealth, culture, literature, civics. It's going to be a riveting conversation. Thank you once again, Yojiji, for helping us understand in a little bit more detail. I look forward to seeing and speaking with everyone. There will be networking opportunities, and there's also a keynote address live in central London that will be taking place on the 18th of September. So please do book your tickets. This was the Vichaar Manthan Sustainable Narratives podcast. Looking forward to speaking with you all very soon. Thank you and namaste.